Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session of GX Talks. GX Talks is a thought leadership initiative by the Emirates Government Service Excellence Program, which is run by the Prime Minister's Office in the United Arab Emirates. In today's panel, I have an amazing list of individuals who work within government circles across the world. And today we're talking about some really important aspects of government services and how to build resilience, trust, digital service, and be predictive about it. So in today's panel, I have some really great individuals. I have, first of all, Jaideep Prabhu, and Jaideep is from the University of Cambridge. He is the author of Frugal Innovation, Jugaad Innovation, and How Should a Government Be? And Jaideep is joining us from the UK. I have Anir Chowdhury, Government of Bangladesh Cabinet Officer, Policy Advisor, leader of Digital Bangladesh Agenda, Policy Advisor of A2I, and from the Prime Minister's Office in Bangladesh, and he's joining us from Dhaka. I have Aleeya Velji, who's Senior Specialist, Innovation and Research, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. She's formerly Strategic Design and Innovation, Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat, and she's joining us from Montreal, Canada. I also have Ryan Androsoff, who's Director of Digital Leadership at Institute on Governance Canada, co-founder of the Canadian Digital Service, Senior Advisor, Digital Government, CIO, Branch Treasury Board Secretary, Government of Canada, MPP, Harvard Kennedy School, and he's joining us from Ottawa today. I am Ian Khan, and I am the founder of Futuracy, and it's my pleasure to host all of you on this incredible panel. Welcome, everybody. So first of all, let's go to Aleeya. And Aleeya, well, we're going to hear from you about your thoughts on government experience, building resilience, and some of these topics. Let's have your thoughts.
Thanks, Ian. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Montreal. This is unceded territory of Indigenous communities. And I've spent time with some Mohawk families in the region of Montreal and learned how important the water is to this region and how the communities here taught many of the settlers how to shoot the rapids and make their way across the country. And my experience in government is similar because I started my career in the West and I moved back East. And so the story of shooting the rapids and using the waters to understand this country really resonates with me. So that's just a part of the story that I share as I come to this work. I'm going to share some slides and talk to you about what I think is required in the innovation spaces of government. I've worked in the municipal, federal, provincial, and now in a crown corporation applying innovation. So this is just a little bit of what I've learned. I'm going to kick it off with some slides. So here's my screen. So I've entitled I've entitled what I want to talk about mission-driven policymaking and sort of like the building blocks. So I want to be a bit practical, but also kind of theoretic. I was a student at Cambridge and very influenced by the UK context in my work. So mission-driven comes from some of the work of Mariana Mazzucato, and I just want to acknowledge that she's really influenced where I think we need to go in government to tackle a lot of the challenges we face today. And I want to bring in that practical piece because I am a designer. So I've been immersed in systemic design and strategic foresight, and I bring the theoretical visionary space together with the practical space. And that's what I'm going to discuss today. So let me just kick it off. So this is kind of what I see that is happening. So we have these complex problems that are interconnected and uncertain. And as a designer, when you work in these spaces, they feel a little bit like this messy squiggle. They're hard to understand, and they really require cross-sector actors to solve these problems. If you move to the middle column, when we think of interconnectedness, we also have to think of some of our systems and how they were formally designed. They were designed in ways that did not really consider externalities. So traditional economics is like separated and value is based on single assets. But now in this interconnected reality, value is derived from relationships. And so we're getting a lot of signals in the system that are pushing us to adapt and adopt this interconnected reality into the way we do work. And if you just think of government fundamentally, it's hierarchical, it's based on silos and divisions, and we're trying to readapt and reinvent what that reality looks like in a very structured environment. So it becomes challenging, but it also is really fun and exciting at the same time. And recently, I would say in the last 10 to 15 years, we're now beginning to operate in these open systems. So these are these invisible operating spaces that we use every day, and they allow citizens and businesses to collaborate and interact and compete in society. And I think social media and the web and our access to the internet is really allowing us to interact in new ways, and information is flowing in different ways. So if you think of these three segments combined together, you have to ask yourself, well, what the heck do we do about this? And how are we going to evolve from what we have in the current state to our future state, or the future is already here? And what do we need? What ingredients do we need to get there? So I think design supports complex problem solving. I also, as a systemic designer, believe that design happens on different places in the system. So if you look at this little chart here, we have impact over time. And I think there's different layers like service design, systemic design, and transformational design. And we have to start thinking about using these three elements simultaneously and at multiple paces, because we want to untangle these complex problems, but they're actually all weaved together and interconnected. So I find good designers these days are really tapping into the layered elements of these systems and learning and adapting how to untangle them by bridging together all these different skill sets. And not only do you need these skill sets to be moving simultaneously and at multiple paces, you also need these mutualistic partnerships across sectors that are pulled together through inter-organizational government and purpose-driven leadership. And if we can, in the perfect world, bring all these things together, I think we can move to solving some of these complex problems that we're facing. And so my next slide is going to show some of the activities that we do to achieve this. So in design, we have this in the middle of the slide, you see the double diamond. We all know that as designers, we work in that space. And what we're really beginning to see is that there's these invisible activities around design that have to come together so that we can live in those mutualistic partnerships and actually work together to untangle some of this complexity. So I think it really starts with vision. If we want to have mission-driven policy, we need purpose-driven leadership that can tell a story about a vision that we want to see. And this is where I think governments need to get stronger at. If we want to break down some of the silos, how can we work with our leadership in intergovernance ways to have a shared vision? And then we can build all the skills around that to push a shared pathway forward. Sometimes it feels like in government, we have all these great innovators that are coming together, but there's no compass. They don't know where they need to go and what they need to focus on to make that systemic change. So I'm borrowing some of this work from the Design Council, and I've also practiced this in a bit of my work, which I'll get to next. And I really believe that we need to connect and build relationships, orient and have a vision, have really strong leadership that can tell a good story, and continue pushing that design journey so we can hit the system at multiple places over time, so we get that impact we're trying to achieve. And these are some of the invisible activities and skill sets we put on the back of our work, on the back end of our work, to push this innovation forward. And what I'm seeing is a bunch of these great innovators coming into the public service, and they just need a compass to help them move forward. So that's something I'm really passionate about, and I want to see leadership really driving some of these skill sets and knowing how to bring out this collective intelligence so we can get that transformational change that society right now is really telling us we need. Finally, I want to talk a bit about some of the work I've been doing. So back in Edmonton, I was in government and also working on a project called the Edmonton Shift Lab. And we were a group of 5 stewards that led a 5-year-long social innovation lab on the topic of racism. And racism is complex, it's layered, it includes a lot of the Indigenous voices that are very present in the Edmonton space. And so what we did as designers was we created what we call this triple helix model. So we weave together Indigenous epistemologies, design thinking, and systemic design. And by doing this, we were able to really empathize with the needs of the people we were trying to serve, and also have systemic impact through prototypes that were designed to create behavior change around how we address racism in our city. Simultaneously, we just had a funder that wanted to see impact. So we weren't bound by the systems that put us in boxes. We were able to play and be free. And what emerged was funding that follows the innovation process. And that funding actually helped our prototype scale over time. So this was a community project that I was a part of while simultaneously being in government. And the lessons I've learned from that are hopefully being infused into government if we can bring out the collective intelligence and allow space for innovation to thrive without boxing it into innovation process, or sorry, government process. I think we kind of have all these innovators in government, but we put them into government process and then they get stuck. And we got to break out of that to solve the complexity, but also respect the system that's in place. So we need these parallel tracks that are working together, that are remixing things, putting them together, and leadership that's kind of letting us go, but creating space for the new to emerge. So it's a bit of a complex thing when you're doing this in government, because government is its own beast. It has its own characteristics. And if you look at the second half of my slide, in the Canadian government, I think we're still experimenting. Like I said, we have all these great innovators that are coming together, but we don't have the compass. We don't have the visionary leadership that's pushing us to take all these design tools and move them in the right direction. So my hope for us getting better at tackling climate change, getting better at tackling the future of what COVID's going to put in front of us, is that we have this ability to remix, to blend, to evolve, and to not box in what innovation truly needs to be within a complex government system. So that's sort of what I am dreaming about in government. And I really think if we want to go fast, we have to go alone. And if we want to go far, we got to go together. And so this is an African proverb, and I think it really speaks to those characteristics of the invisible activities that we need, combined with the mutualistic partnerships across the various sectors, moving at a simultaneous space across the innovation design types and over time to create that impact we want to see. We're in this pivotal moment, and if we can get the ingredients right, I think we'll be really good in the future. So that's my talk. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Aleeya. I think that was very insightful, and thanks for sharing. Thanks for sharing your perspective. I'd like to move on to Ryan and more global perspective. Ryan, the floor is all yours. Please take it away.
Thanks so much, Ian, and really great to be here with you today and with the rest of the panel talking about these really important issues. What I'd like to do in terms of some opening framing today is talk a little bit about some of the lessons that I've learned and seen from the past decade of being involved in leading digital transformation initiatives here in Canada. And I should be clear that obviously the digital transformation story in Canada goes far further back than just a decade. But I'm going to talk, specifically about my experience and give a little bit of that broader context of what I think some of the big issues that we are facing here are right now. And I think many of those are probably relatable to people working in digital transformation around the world. In the work that I do now, in the 3 years since I left government, with my partnership with the Institute on Governance, I've been really focused on this issue of digital leadership and digital skills development for public servants, and particularly for public service executives. I think, this is one of the critical pieces that we're really seeing, is that digital has become more than just a back office function that is about, making sure our technology runs, but it's actually becoming something that impacts everybody in government. And so one of my big missions now is trying to work with governments to help them build up the skills and capacity that they need to really become a digital organization in a deeper way. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But I want to talk a little bit about the journey that I think here in Canada government has gone through in terms of the phases of digital evolution. And I think this is probably largely true for many other countries around the world. And in some ways, it really started in the mid-1990s, early 2000s. And in the federal government here in Canada, this is what they called kind of the government online era. There was a large initiative, almost $1 billion of investment over a 4 or 5 year period, to, for the first time, move a lot of government information online onto the web, which back in the 1990s was obviously still quite a new technology for most people. Canada was really seen actually at the time as a world leader in this space. And, by the early 2000s, Canada was regularly leading a lot of international rankings around what was at the time being called e-government. It had done a lot of effort on taking information and taking the most used services and moving them into web-based formats. We then had this second phase in the mid 2000s to mid 2010s of what people at the time were calling government 2.0. And I think this was really about the rise of social media and things like, Wikipedia and YouTube and Facebook that we take for granted today were brand new back then. And they were really changing the model in which citizens and government talk to each other. They were changing the model of how the internet itself was being used. The internet was becoming much more decentralized in a way, and less of a publishing platform and more of a collaboration platform, which has a lot of huge implications for organizations like government that tend to be much more hierarchical in terms of their rules and how they work. This was also the time period where we saw a lot of emphasis being put on open government initiatives, open government, open data, greater transparency by publishing information online, and certainly by publishing data sets and raw information in a different way. And this really kind of characterized where a lot of the effort was back then. And I think governments to this day are still trying to deal with some of the implications that were coming out of the rise of these new technologies and these new ways of transparency and sharing information online. I do think now in the last few years, we've moved into this new phase of what people are calling digital government. And I do think digital government is distinct from those previous phases, in that it is much more about using technology to go beyond just delivering services or sharing information online, but to really say, how do we take advantage of both the technology and these new ways of working to actually reimagine our institutions themselves, to rethink about processes and policies and how governments work. There's a lot of different definitions about what digital government means. This is a definition that my former team from the OECD uses. And I think importantly, two things I want to highlight from this, that it highlights the number one, that digital government is part of a modernization strategy. So I think digital government is beyond just service delivery. It's about a deeper modernization of how government works. And secondly, I think importantly, it talks about this notion that it's an ecosystem approach, that it's not just government doing it alone, but it's often government working with NGOs, with businesses, with citizens, in some cases, a much more decentralized way than it would have in the past when it was undertaking transformation or modernization. Now, part of that modernization has been, we've seen a number of governments around the world, the introduction of special purpose digital teams to help bring in new skill sets and drive some of that transformation. I had the pleasure of being involved in that journey here in Canada about 5 years ago. In 2016, I had come back to Canada from the OECD, rejoined the federal government, and led a series of cross-country consultations around digital service modernization, where we reached out to over 1,000 stakeholders across the country, really looking at that time with the Liberal government who had just come into power a few months earlier, how we could really move forward the digital service story for the federal government. And one of the things that came out of that consultation process was the creation of the Canadian Digital Service Team. This was a special purpose digital services team that was launched in 2017. And it was very much modeled on the approach that the Government Digital Service in the UK, 18F, and US Digital Service in the US, and other countries around the world had been taking to say that above and beyond kind of our existing IT infrastructure in government, that we have to start finding a way to be able to bring in different types of skill sets into government, bring people who might traditionally not have thought about a government career and might have been in the private sector, bring them into government, match them up with people who understand how government works and be able to harness that innovation to really kind of drive us forward in a different way and bring a much more agile, user-centric lens into how we do technology within government. I think this has been one of the approaches that governments around the world have been taking, is to realize that the kind of the traditional organizational ways are not always getting the results that they want to see. I think this is kind of part of this broader transformation we're seeing within government. And, I often like to kind of talk about digital government from the perspective of that at the end of the day, we're really trying to influence the platforms and processes of government, right? Kind of the messy middle parts of how government works. Initiatives like the Canadian Digital Service are part of this leadership and policy layer that are really trying to drive the way government works in a bit of a different direction. But I'm a big believer, I think, and from what I've seen both in Canada and around the world, that leadership and policy is not enough by itself. And you actually need to focus on that broad base of the pyramid of people and skills, which is really a realization that, governments are human organizations, right? They're made up of people. And if you can't bring those people along with you, it's going to be tough to have sustainable change over time in the organization. And as I mentioned, that's a lot of the work that I'm doing now is around focusing on that base of the pyramid in terms of thinking about how do we have a more digitally literate and digitally conscious organization that can help drive change. Through the Institute on Governance, I run a digital executive leadership program for public service executives. We've had over 120 people so far participate in it from over 24 different federal departments, as well as other jurisdictions as well. And I want to just share with you a few of the lessons and I think kind of consensus that's come out of the work that we're doing with public sector executives around where they're seeing some of the big challenges today that government still needs to tackle to really take it to the next level. And so number one, we have heard that digital is no longer just the domain of IT, right? Whereas, 10, 20 years ago, digital was kind of viewed as being the role of the CIO and the IT team. I think people are now seeing that it's part of everybody's job and it's influencing everybody's work within government, regardless of what they do. We're also seeing that, there is a much more broad understanding and acceptance of concepts and methodologies like user-centered design and agile. And I think a consensus that this is where we need to be going as a government. However, the reality is that the ways of working in the public service have not caught up to that. And time again, I hear challenges around how budgeting and financing is done, how project approvals and project gating are done, things like procurement and HR come up time and time again. And so, on the one hand, we've got, I think, leadership, rightfully so, pushing us to be much more innovative in how we work, but a lot of the operating rules of how government still functions at a base level haven't yet changed. I think we've also seen that the rise of social media over the past decade and it's the way that it permeates daily life and professional life certainly has opened up new possibilities for government. But for a lot of executives, there's also an increasing kind of signal to noise problem. I'm really trying to be able to sort through all of the information that they're getting from a whole variety of different sources. And to be frank, to be able to have the space to be able to make decisions and think strategically. And I would then add that there's also this kind of deep sense of transformation fatigue, right? There has been kind of continuous rounds of transformation and modernization over the past number of years, past number of decades. And I think, this is one of the realities is that we're going through yet another round of transformation, in part sparked by COVID. And I think it's a realization that some of the people who have to drive that transformation in the organization have gone through many rounds of this, and we have to be conscious of how to be successful. And of course, finally, the elephant in the room around all of this is what's happened over the last year with the impact that COVID has had. And I think, COVID certainly for many governments, and I think it's very much true here in Canada, has on the one hand really raised citizens' expectations around digital service delivery. Everybody's lives have been pushed online, and citizens are now expecting more from their governments than ever before in terms of what they can do in terms of digital service delivery. The other side, of course, is that it has changed how employees themselves are working in the public service, right? Government moved from being a fairly traditional organization in terms of in-person work to now being much more remote, potentially much more flexible. And I think there's some very interesting and potentially difficult questions to come in the next few months around what the hopeful return to the new normal looks like. And as we turn the corner on COVID, hopefully in the next number of months, to rethink about what parts of that experience do we retain, and what parts do we go back to in terms of our previous ways of working. The final thing I want to share with all of you, I think, and hopefully it's been clear from my introduction, that I really view digital as being not just service delivery, but about deeper modernization within government. And I want to share with you kind of my Pac-Man model of change, because I think, there's the old adage that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think that's 100% true. You can have the best digital strategy in the world, but if you don't have a culture in your organization to support it, it's not going to get you very far. But I think there's two layers beyond that. And I would argue that incentives eat culture and structures eat everything else. And what I mean by that is, incentives are the ways within the organization that people are rewarded. How are they promoted? How are they disciplined, right? What gets measured? How do you decide what's important or not? These things actually can change and overwhelm your culture. And if they're not aligned, ultimately can drive where things go. And I would argue, particularly in an organization like government, things like how do you make decisions around budgeting, who gets to make decisions, how do you govern your organization, the types of policies and regulations you have, those ultimately dictate the direction your organization goes in. And so, my closing thought, I would say, is that as governments are really thinking about the future of where they're going on digital, I really think increasingly there has to be a lot more focus on the structures and incentives of the organization. Because until we start really moving those, it's going to be difficult for us to have sustained change over time across organizations that are as large and as complex as government is. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you so much, Ian, and I'll turn the floor back to you.
Thank you so much, Ryan. That was really insightful, and we really appreciate your content. I want to move next to Jaideep. Jaideep Prabhu is with University of Cambridge, multiple times author, and I've been waiting to hear from Jaideep as well. So Jaideep.
Thank you so much, Ian. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you to talk about my new book, How Should a Government Be? The New Levers of State Power. So as a business school professor, I've studied innovation throughout my career, and I have been particularly interested in this notion of frugal innovation in the private sector. How small teams increasingly are able to do things that only large companies or big government labs could have done maybe 10 or 20 years ago. And I've observed how these teams are developing highly affordable solutions, faster, better, and cheaper across sectors around the world. And often these solutions are addressing social problems that impinge on public services and the state. For instance, we see this in software. Something like WhatsApp was developed by 4 people in under a year with about 250K in seed funding. It generated huge value for hundreds of millions of people who adopted it. And then, of course, it created a lot of value for the owners when they sold to Facebook for almost $20 billion. So we see this in software. We see this in hardware as well. This is a former mature student of ours here in Cambridge, Eben Upton, who along with his colleagues in computer science were very worried about young people in the UK not learning to tinker with computers and code. And so they came up with this very cheap computer, this basic microprocessor called the Raspberry Pi, which was originally $30. They now have a $5 version to help kids to learn how to code and to tinker with computers. And now we have a whole open source hardware industry and ecosystem around the world around computers like this. We also see this phenomenon in emerging economies like Kenya, where Vodafone introduced this service M-Pesa that enables a lady from a village in Kenya to use her basic phone to call her son, who may be working in Nairobi, earning an income, to speak to him, but also to ask him to send money home in an emergency, which he can do by simply texting it to her. She can receive it on her phone and then cash it in the neighboring corner shop, which is the M-Pesa agent. So you see this kind of frugal financial inclusion in places like the emerging world. But you also see this phenomenon of frugal innovation in the West. This is a spin-out company, CellScope, from UC Berkeley, who have developed a whole suite of medical devices that leverage the computing power and connectivity of smartphones to do telemedicine. So this is an otoscope here that a mother can use to take very high resolution pictures of the inner ear of her daughter when she has an infection and send it to a consultant who's somewhere else. These devices are a fraction of the cost of the standalone devices and enable telemedicine. So I've looked at many such examples and have written about this phenomenon in 2 books. The first book, which came out in 2012, was very much about this phenomenon in emerging markets like India, where you have serious resource constraints. And then following that, we wrote a follow-up book, which was very much about the same phenomenon in the West for the West. And of course, these books are about mainly the private sector. But whenever I spoke about them to audiences anywhere, invariably somebody would always ask me the question, so what does this mean for governments? And so I began to think about that question and realized there were 2 aspects to it. One, there was this question of what does it mean for governments and how they do their work, how they deliver for their citizens, how can they do that faster, better, and cheaper? But then there's a second aspect to this, which is what is the role of the government in regulating and cultivating this phenomenon in the wider economy? And so I began to think about this, and eventually 5 years later, I have a book which sort of captures my thinking. And when I started to think about this question, how should a government be? I went back to what others had said about it. And of course, there's a long debate between people in 2 camps. You have on one side, the libertarians, who are generally skeptical of government and think that governments are at best inefficient and ineffective, and at worst can be authoritarian and dangerous. And at the other end, you have people who are called statists, who are generally much more sanguine about the role of government, and they think that governments are the only force that can redress, the vagaries and injustices of nature or the market. And like all polar views, there's obviously elements of truth in each of them. Yes, governments can be inefficient and ineffective, but equally, governments have a crucial role to play. And so I look at that vast middle ground when, where governments have a role to understand how they can do that efficiently and effectively without, of course, trampling on our freedoms. And I look at that, both in times of stability as well as in times of crisis, like now with the pandemic. And in many ways, I do this not theoretically. I actually look at examples from around the world of cases of governments doing this. And what I find really is that, yes, governments can be inefficient and effective, but of course, we can also have examples of governments that have overcome obstacles to be able to deliver better for their citizens. But striking that balance is the challenge. And in some ways, the situation we face today is a bit like the situation in the 1930s, when the world was facing, the aftermath of the Great Depression, and you had competing state systems around the world. You had the Soviets in Russia and the Soviet Union, you had Nazi Germany, and then you had the New Deal. And Keynes at that time wrote that, the authoritarian state systems of today seem to solve the problem of unemployment at the expense of efficiency and freedom, but it may be possible by right analysis to cure the disease whilst preserving efficiency and freedom. And it's really that balance between effectiveness, efficiency, and freedom that I take up in the book. And what I argue is that governments today increasingly have access to new types of technologies, ubiquitous technologies, new ways of organizing that they can use to be more efficient and effective. But equally, they have to adopt certain principles if they want to balance that with ensuring our freedom, our privacy, the security of our data, and so on. And these are the 5 principles I explore in the book. Governments need to be responsive to citizens, placing them at the center of everything they do. Governments have to be inclusive and balance the competing interests of different groups of people in society. They have to experiment, trying out new ideas, testing them, and then learning from them quickly. They have to be entrepreneurial in that they have to be proactive and engage early with new opportunities and new players in any economy. And finally, government has to be innovative throughout. I also argue at the end of the book that citizens have a role in this whole process by holding their governments to account. So let me quickly run through these principles. In the responsive state, I look at citizen centricity and how states and governments should work outside in from the perspective of the citizen rather than inside out from the perspective of the bureaucracy when they're designing and delivering solutions to people. Often this can be enabled by actually involving citizens in the design and delivery of the solutions. And here I look at the case of social care and public services more generally. I particularly look at the case of a Dutch organization, Buurtzorg, that has done very interesting things in this space, not only in the Netherlands, but in other countries around the world. I then turn to the inclusive state, how the state can balance the needs of different groups of citizens. Here I look at Denmark and how over many decades, it has used this principle of flexicurity to balance the interests of employers who want flexibility in the labor market with the needs of job seekers who are looking for security and training. I also look at new ideas like the universal basic income and related schemes, and I find that in theory, these might or might not work, but what we need is actual application and learning from that application. And so I turn to the experimental state, how states need to try new solutions in pilots to reduce the risk of failure, evaluate them, and then scale these solutions when they've learned what works. In this chapter, I look at the UK's behavioral insights team and also the What Works networks in various areas like education and criminal justice, which is driving evidence-based policy. So those 3 principles are very much about how the government can do its own work. I then turn to what does the government need to do in order to manage the economy? And here, first, I look at regulation, and I argue that governments must be proactive and engage early with new technologies and new players in order to be able to get these sectors to flourish while minimizing the potential downsides. I look at how the Kenyan Central Bank did this with that service M-Pesa that I mentioned earlier. And then I look at how various US states and the UK have been regulating autonomous vehicles and engaging early in order to learn and to identify what are the key areas where they need to regulate. There's also an aspect of cultivating the economy, not just regulating it. And this is what we might call industrial strategy. Here, I continue the case of autonomous vehicles and look at how the UK has used small pots of money and challenges thrown out to companies and other players to get them to collaborate, to come together, to test out new technologies and business models. And so you have an ecosystem that builds up of various players that are needed in this new space, from large to small car companies, to software and telecoms companies, insurance companies, universities, and even cities. And I see how this is happening in the space race in the US, how NASA is collaborating with private sector companies. I also look at how cities like Barcelona have worked with communities of makers in maker spaces to drive this kind of flourishing, frugal innovation in society. And I argue that really states must learn how to steer and avoid the temptation to do all the heavy lifting and rowing. I then turn to the innovative state. And here I focus on a culture of innovation in government. And I look at this at various levels. I look at it at the city level of Boston and how the mayor's office has been doing this there. I interviewed Aleeya and learned from her about how creating a culture of innovation at the city, provincial, and federal level is a very different ballgame, and how it gets harder when you move to the federal level. And I spoke at length to Anir to learn about the UNDP-led A2I program in Bangladesh and how they have created a culture of innovation throughout the bureaucracy. In my final chapter, I then look at how citizens can hold their governments to account, not only by being engaged and informed and choosing good leaders during elections, but also between elections by being involved in civil society, and of course, ideally by going to work for the government and being within change, being the change from within. So that's my book in a nutshell. I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Ian.
Jaideep, thank you so much for your insights, and thank you everybody for hanging in there and making this leadership panel possible. Last but not least, I want to move to Anir, who's joining us from Dhaka, to take it away and tell us a little bit more about his insights.
Thank you, Ian. Let me share my slides. My three previous speakers have already set the stage for what I'm going to talk about, the last 12 years of journey of digital Bangladesh. But interestingly, what we have found is that story, even though we call it digital, is actually way beyond digital. It's about a lot of the things that Jaideep and the others have really talked about. And let me talk about three concepts that we're trying to grapple with. Repurposing the existing assets, digital and otherwise, unprecedented collaboration that we have really seen gelling together in a way that we have not seen during the COVID time period, and then hacking the mindset. So let me talk about these three things with some examples. Let me start with where digital Bangladesh started. About 12, 13 years ago, 2008, end of 2008, when our Honorable Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, actually announced that Bangladesh would be a digital nation by 2021, the 50th anniversary of the country's birth. So when this was announced, it sounded rather ridiculous. The entire government was ridiculed for a year or two. We had about 10% government officials who had computers, but they were not really used, and they were treated as sacred objects because using them would mean that they would actually go bad. So better not use these expensive machines. Let me talk about the contrast that has happened in the subsequent 12 years between 2008 and 2020. The mindset really went from business as usual to rather a leapfrogging. And I'll talk about examples that go beyond digital. So poverty has come down significantly. We have halved poverty in the last 12 years. Not digital literacy, but general literacy went from below 50% to above 70%. Electricity generation, as you've seen, has actually gone up by leaps and bounds to cover most of the country. Internet usage went up over 100 times. Mobile penetration also a number of times. Digital services, the lifeblood of digital Bangladesh, went from less than 10 to about 1,000 services that we now offer digitally. One-stop service centers. So this is the bridge between the analog citizens who don't have the right skill or the affordability to access digital services. They come to these one-stop centers. We have actually now close to 7,000 centers in different parts of the country, in rural areas mostly, where people can actually go almost within walking distance and can apply for digital services. So this is the bridge between analog citizens and the digital world of services. We had probably about 100 or so government websites at that time, just offering information based on our Right to Information Act. But now we have one site. But this one site now covers 50,000+ office of the government. So the entire government has come under one umbrella. So that's unprecedented collaboration within the government. And in terms of chief innovation officers, we don't call them information officers, we call them innovation officers to give them prestige and pride to actually innovate and experiment with digital and with organizational structure. So we now have about 1,000 chief innovation officers in different departments, districts and sub-districts, and they have innovation teams supporting them. and that those teams consist of technology and non-technology folks. Measurement has been extremely key. So in our annual performance agreement, that is a contract signed between the Cabinet Office and every line ministry, we've actually tracked progress of about 100 services that went from analog to digital. And we have seen that we have saved citizens about 2 billion work days, about $8 billion, and about 1 billion visits have been eliminated. So this is an important characteristic, important metric, which actually guide our government innovators. Let me talk a little bit about repurposing during the COVID timeframe. So we have a national helpline, which is 333, which was launched in 2018, typically used for providing information about different types of government services. So where do I go to get a passport? How much will it cost? How do I change the address in my national ID? What does it take to get a land record from a particular district, so on and so forth. But during COVID, this was repurposed multiple times. So first, it became a helpline to address child marriages. So a lot of child marriage issues came in because the schools were closed, child marriages went up, and calls would come in, and local administrators would be notified by the operators, and thousands of child marriages actually have been stopped during this time. Then it was repurposed to take corona-related calls, COVID-related calls. Because we did not have enough RT-PCR labs in the country, we had to depend on people's self-reporting. So we used an artificial intelligence-based system, and this was developed primarily by our telecom companies, so not by the government. So we had an interesting collaboration with them. So based on self-reporting of symptoms, we were able to tell where the disease was progressing 7 to 10 days before it was before we actually had testing in those areas. Then this system was repurposed again to develop the largest telemedicine service in the country. We have a number of telemedicine companies in the country, but not really doing very well. There were small, few doctors in each of them. So we had a call to action, and about 4,500 volunteer doctors in an Uber model. So we call it the Uber doctor pool. And they came in to support people who were calling in with symptoms, with the most dire symptoms, severe symptoms. So they actually got telemedicine help. So we had 4 million calls that came in through the system over a period of several months. Then this was repurposed again to provide emergency food support. We were under lockdown for 9 weeks, middle of last year. We're again under lockdown this time in the last few weeks because Corona is surging again. And people could call into this line to ask for emergency food support. And the calls would be verified by local administrators, and food support would be provided. So the last repurposing that we did a few months ago was to make this into an e-commerce line as well. We call it P-commerce, phone commerce. People who did not have access to internet could call into this line to actually pay for food. So instead of doing internet-based e-commerce orders, they would do phone-based e-commerce orders. This is a picture of how we actually, this was during the April-May timeframe last year. We did not have enough RT-PCR labs in the country. I think we had about 1 or 2 for a country of 165 million. Now we have over 300 labs around the country which do testing, but at that time we did not. So we used, as I mentioned, the artificial intelligence-based system to track where the disease was progressing the fastest and prioritize health interventions. I talked about the system that emerged. We call it the COVID-19 collective intelligence system. So data coming in from citizens, from hospitals, from test labs into this one giant repository where the analytics is done and data is verified by doctors, and they are published for both treatment and also for public awareness. So this is a massive data intelligence system that has emerged almost without planning. But because we had a lot of collaboration that was catalyzed during this time, but also a lot of building blocks on which to build these systems. A quick example, this was introduced a few years ago, so not during COVID, but this actually changed the mindset of service providers. We used Facebook to take in citizens' grievances. We tried different mechanisms, nothing worked. Facebook really worked. And that's where young people actually posted irregularities, complaints about government services, bribes in many cases. And government officers starting posting pictures that they took from these website groups, Facebook groups, in letters. So we had not seen letters containing government official letters containing pictures before that. So here, a government officer would actually post a picture saying that, okay, this is something that we need to take care of immediately. Unfortunately, the text is in Bangla, but rest assured that this is a real letter that went from one department to another with a picture that needed to be addressed, an issue that needed to be addressed. We introduced a few years ago something called the empathy training. And my previous speakers talked about how the providers need to be more citizen-centric. And this empathy training actually helped us become more citizen-centric. About 6,000 civil servants actually went through this. They launched about 2,000 new innovations within the country. About 50 of them actually were scaled up across the entire government. This is an example of a doctor in the southern part of the country who realized after the empathy training that 2,000 of his most vulnerable patients, households, do not come to his clinic because they feel that they'd get pushed around, they don't wear the right clothes, they don't look official, professional, so they would not get service. So what he did was he developed a paper card. He called it the VIP card. And the VIP card actually contained information about the household, their treatment history, medical history. And when they show up with these cards, he takes them to a VIP line so that they get the best service and prompt service. So this is now being seen as a basis for universal healthcare. He waived fees in certain cases without asking the Ministry of Health. I mean, this was a violation of a government protocol. Instead of being reprimanded for that, he was actually rewarded. And now we're looking at this as a way to do universal healthcare and health insurance potentially in the future. This is an example of how different building blocks that have emerged over the last 12 years are coming together to construct new solutions very quickly. We call them policy Legos. So 4 different types of policy Legos have emerged, and they are a national ID, which is a biometrically verified ID identification system that we have. Payments ecosystem, where we have digitized a large part of our social safety net payment, which is almost 14% of our national budget that goes into social safety net, and different types of payments between government and citizens, so that those have been largely digitized. Simplification of service delivery. So this is a very important concept where digitization is preceded by simplification, because if we digitize inefficiency, we actually often amplify the inefficiency. So we want to simplify the service delivery process, eliminate steps, and that's how we have reduced the time, cost, and visits in such large numbers, the TCVs. And the last component of policy Legos is data. So data coming in, and COVID actually really has shown us how important data is for real-time decision-making or near real-time decision-making. So these 4 components, ID, payments, service simplification, and data blocks, are giving us unprecedented way to construct new innovations very quickly. So I talked about repurposing 333. We were able to do that so quickly because we had building blocks that supported this, and we can mix and match very quickly. We were also able to launch a digital court system called My Court within 12 days by repurposing some of the old building blocks. So again, something that would have taken us months, if not over a year, we were able to do in 12 days. I'll end with 6 paradigm shifts that we have seen in the last 12 years of working. The first is role reversal. So instead of citizens coming to government offices, we're basically saying the services have to go to citizens. So this is a mindset change that we are seeing within bureaucracy and within politicians. Big bang approaches have not really worked. So bottom-up and iterative development with a lot of experimentation, a lot of failures, and learning from failures and success and scaling up successes have really worked for us. Silo breaking is extremely important. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of this. Government works in silos, and we digitize those silos sometimes. So digital silos don't really help citizens. Citizens don't see governments as a set of departments. They see government as one black box, and they want to get services from that. So breaking of silos within the government is extremely important, and also with the private sector. So we have seen a lot of data sharing. I talked about how the telcos have really helped us with their data, anonymized data that could allow us to track disease without the RT-PCR labs. So we are seeing really promising signs that breaking silo is happening. End of subsidies. The way we do digitization often is that we continue to subsidize models. And what we have seen in Bangladesh is, I talked about digital centers at the very beginning of my presentation. These digital centers are public-private partnerships. So they're hosted in government offices, but are run by small micro entrepreneurs who charge a small fee for every service that they give to the citizens. These could be public services, could be private services. So these 7,000 or so digital centers now sell about 270 different types of services. So this model has really worked for us to reduce TCV, but also to make these financially sustainable. The concept of govpreneurship is when we are saying that do experiment, we're also giving a license to fail to government officials. So I'll end my last slide with a bit more on govpreneurship. And the last thing is data, how important it has been for decision-making on real time, which is extremely critical for situations like the pandemic. This is my last slide where I'll talk about the concept of godpreneurship. And this has been extremely critical, that breeding a set of entrepreneurs within government with 4 different things that are important. A sense of purpose. TCV reduction is the sense of purpose that we have driven. A sense of autonomy, that they can make decisions without really looking at rules and without asking the boss. So we have allowed a lot of experimentation because of the Prime Minister's office and the Cabinet office have been involved in the digitization process, and the Digital Bangladesh story is really driven by the Prime Minister's office and the Cabinet office with the support from the ICT division. So the autonomy has really been nurtured quite a bit. Collaboration I talked about, so that's where a lot of collaboration within government departments and with the private sector has been extremely important. And developing the right competence to try out different experiments, build the right building blocks, and then put the building blocks together for innovative solutions. I end with 3 questions that are now facing us. So how do we define profits and incentives for govpreneurs? So obviously, entrepreneurs are driven by profits and incentives. So it's financial profit, financial return in the private sector. So what is the return for govpreneurs? And in our case, it has been TCV, but perhaps in different contexts, it will be different. And then the building blocks. So experimentation requires building blocks to try. So it's essentially policy Legos that come together and allow me to try out something very quickly. I don't want to start from scratch. I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I just want to try out something very quickly in 3 months to see if something works. And if it works, I scale that up. If it doesn't work, then I deconstruct and then try something different. And then in terms of incentives and these building blocks, do they differ from government to government? And that's where the collective intelligence of this panel and other experts around the world, I think, may offer some answers.
Anir, thank you so much for your insights, and we really appreciate you sharing that information. I am going to move really quickly into a Q&A, and I appreciate that we are over time, so I don't want to hold everybody up more than necessary, but I'll try and wrap this up with 1 question each to everyone, and then we'll wrap up if everybody's okay with that. I want to ask a few direct questions, starting with Aleeya. Aleeya, my question to you is, what challenges will government face in designing and delivering the next generation of services in a world that will start recovering from COVID-19 very soon? And how can these be turned into opportunities? Help us understand that a little bit if you can.
Okay, big question. I'll try to do this really quickly. I'll come back to what both Anir, Ryan, and I think Jaideep have said. We need the innovation in the structure space. So what I was describing is we're bringing in all these great people with all these amazing talents, and we need 1, leadership to bring out that collective intelligence, and 2, we need to be able to play in the structures space. So how do we procure things faster? How do we regulate some of the new technologies that are coming in so they're beneficial for society and not harmful? Examples like this, like that structural innovation is really important. And I think we can use all the skills that are coming into government, as Ryan described, like trying to get the non-traditional public servant into the public servant and to become an entrepreneur. I think that's happening. But I don't think we're able to capitalize on that because we don't give them the space to play in the structural space. And when you reach that moment in the government system within the Canadian context, it's a roadblock. And I think we need some of the learnings from Bangladesh to come into Canada to help us move more deeply into that space, because those are the types of challenges that we need to unlock to untangle ourselves from the complexity that COVID is showing us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Aleeya. Ryan, I want to move on to you and from one Canadian to the other. You've done a lot of work around social media in the public sector. How do you think social media can help in creating the right and effective message on citizen services? Any recommendations or observations?
Yeah, I think it's a pertinent question because even though, for those of us who have been working in this space for a while, social media almost feels kind of like old hat at this point. It's been around for over a decade. The reality is I think governments are still adjusting to it, and I don't think it's fully lived up to its potential yet. And and I think on the one hand, one of the ways that we've seen it be really effective is obviously to give a more personalized voice to public servants as they're engaging with the public. And I think that's going to be one of actually the important parts of maturity in terms of using online communication platforms like social media, is moving away from that traditional model where it's the institution that's talking to people to actually giving individual public servants a voice and a bit more profile. And that's, that can be tough sometimes, right? We're used to, certainly in Canada and a lot of other Commonwealth countries, we have the Westminster system of government, where traditionally it was only the elected official that had a public voice around this. I think social media is really flipping that dynamic a lot. And governments are going to have to come to terms, and have been working on that for a while, to say, what does that new reality look like where individual public servants actually have a lot more autonomy and can be much more connected with citizens? I think if done well, it can help build trust. And I'll just add that notion of trust, I think, is increasingly important. One of the things, I talk a lot about in our work these days is around how do you maintain trust in a digital world? And we've seen, some, obviously blatant examples in recent months and years around the spread of online disinformation, around some of the real social harms that can come, that social media is amplifying in some ways. And so I actually think instead of government retreating away from it, we actually need governments to be more actively engaged, to be those voices of truthful information, to be able to combat disinformation online. And I really do think part of that's going to be allowing governments to empower public servants themselves, to be able to build those networks, to be able to share more broadly. And that's going to give people within government a greater insight into what citizens are facing, and I think that only leads to them being more connected and ultimately producing better services at the end of the day.
Thank you, Ryan. Jaideep, I want to move on to you and ask you about this big word that we always talk about, and that is trust. Trust has become one of the most discussed issues, topics, go-tos, and how can progressive governments work to increase the trusts that citizens, stakeholders, residents have in them?
Great question, Ian. And trust is so fundamental to how any organization works, and then particularly a complex organization like a country or society, where there are so many different forces pulling it apart potentially. So trust is the glue that keeps economies and societies and countries together. And alarmingly, the trust in government in particular has fallen quite dramatically, or is quite low actually throughout the world. There are companies that do annual surveys of trust in various institutions like government, business, media, and NGOs. And one of these, Edelman, for instance, finds that government is consistently at the bottom of the pile when you look at these four institutions. And that in many countries around the world, people tend to trust even businesses more than they trust government, and they trust NGOs more than they trust government. So why is that? And what is at the heart of that? And it seems that there are two things. One is competence, and the other is integrity. And we expect competence and integrity from the government. In fact, the pressures on governments to be competent to deliver faster, better, cheaper for their citizens, the pressures on them to do that with integrity are enormous, not just during stable times, but particularly during crises like financial crises or a pandemic. And governments really need to step up there. Often the private sector, maybe because they're doing simpler things and they work with simpler structures, or maybe because they've had enormous competitive pressures, shareholder pressures, they have learned over the last couple of decades to really use new tools and technologies to be able to do things faster, better, and cheaper, to organize differently. It's now time for governments to step in and step up and to do precisely that. In fact, other panelists have talked about many different ways in which governments can and should do that. Placing the citizen at the heart of what they wish to achieve, starting with the citizen, learning about the problem that the citizen is facing, the context in which they're facing it, then looking to design the best service around it, the simplest, the most convenient service, using tools that are available digitally and so on. So we know there is an approach, we know there are toolkits, we know this is being done in many places, in many governments around the world. We just need to be able to do more of it and do it systemically.
Thank you, Jaideep. Anir, I want to go to you and ask you about especially technology. And my question is, public service leaders are increasingly facing policy issues that are tied to advancement in technology. And you spoke about technology earlier. How do we make them ready to navigate these challenges? How do we enable public servants to navigate these technology challenges through changes in policy?
Thank you, Ian. Recently, from the Cabinet Office, we started a way to embed Fourth Industrial Revolution technologies in every ministry. In 2008, the way we actually prompted digitization was to ask every secretary to come up with one quick win, one specific citizen service that could be digitized to reduce TCV. Now we're asking our same secretary, well, new cadre of secretaries, the same secretaries are not there anymore, asking them to embed artificial intelligence, big data, blockchain in the way they deliver services. So a lot of new policy challenges have come up. We don't even know what artificial intelligence means. What does bias mean in AI? What does big data even mean? Like, how big is big? So when we talk about size, that's not big data. What does blockchain really mean? So all these new issues are coming up, and we're trying to grapple with them. But what we want them to do is to just get their feet wet, just try things out. So we want to see experiments first before we actually impose policy and regulation, because we don't want to straitjacket anybody. But at the same time, things that we already know that will require regulation, that will require policy, such as privacy. During COVID, we have used a lot of telco data. We've anonymized them, but at the same time, I feel that we may have violated privacy provisions because we didn't even know what we were doing. We just needed to know where the disease was heading, and we used a lot of data. We used mobility data, where people were moving around. COVID positive patients, we had to track them because they just were not quarantining themselves at home, and we did not have enough isolation centers. So all these things now are coming up that we know certain things. We also don't know certain things. The things that we know that we need to regulate, that we need to put policy fences around them, we are imposing policy. For instance, we're now drafting a privacy policy, again, judging from our experiences. So what I would suggest there is that as much as possible, we don't want to straitjacket innovation. We want to allow experimentation and then put the right policies around these experiments to make sure that we're not violating any human rights, or we're not violating any. So we want to be citizen-centric. So the whole name of the game is as much citizen-centricity as possible. And that's how we are doing policy in Bangladesh.
Thank you, Anir. I want to conclude with one question for everybody, and feel free to jump up and say, hey, I want to answer this first. It's a two-pronged question. First part is, what do you think government will be? Where will government be by 2030? What is your vision of that? And the second part of this is, what are your top one or two recommendations for governments to be progressive, to build trust, to be more resilient, to battle the challenges, all of those put together. So feel free, whoever wants to go first.
So I'll venture in first just to tackle this. You know, if I think about where government digital is going to be going over the next decade, to me, one of I think the hallmarks of it is going to be greater individualization, right? And I think as we see the rise of artificial intelligence, I think we're going to see people accessing and interacting with government in very non-traditional ways. You know, today we still think about websites a lot of the time as kind of our primary delivery mechanism. I think that's going to look very different 10 years from now. I mean, I would suspect most people are going to essentially have the equivalent of kind of a personal AI assistant that will actually do the interaction for them. And that actually has a lot of implications for how government structures its data, for how it sets things up and how it interacts with people. And then I guess, so your second question, you know, to me, that goes back to that whole notion of how do we actually start thinking about the structures and incentives of how government itself works? Because if we're moving to a much more individualized, customized service delivery for citizens, the traditional way that we've structured how government works isn't going to make sense in that world. And I think we really have to fundamentally start asking some deep questions about what should government look like that's actually fit for purpose in the digital age. And I don't think it's the way it is today. I think hopefully by 10 years from now, we're going to see some governments experimenting with very different structures, very different ways of working that allow them to be much more innovative and flexible than they are today.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ryan. Okay, who would want to go next?
I can
Go
go
ahead.
next. So by 2030, in my world of housing right now, we say in Canada by 2030, everyone is going to have a house that is affordable and meets their needs. So if you think of real estate and how much that is connected to our society and how important home has become during COVID, I think we really need to try to achieve that for the future. I would also say that if I could give, my top one or two ideas of where we need to go and what we need to do, I think to achieve this goal that I just described, we need inter-organizational governance. So we need to begin to work better across the silos in government, and perhaps digital can help us get there. And I think we also need to bring together sectors, so policy, finance, climate, technology, and civil society. How do we enable all of those things to function better through good purpose-driven leadership that's weave together through inter-organizational government? It sounds super complex, but I think with the right minds coming together and the ability to touch the structures, we can bring out the collaborative intelligence to achieve that.
Thank you, Aleeya. Anir, how about you? Vision 2030 and top one or two recommendations, and then we'll conclude with Jaideep.
Sure. We have a vision 2041. So we had a vision 2021, which is achieving a middle income status in terms of our per capita income. 2041 is the milestone to achieve the developed country status. 2030 is just in the middle, and that's also aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's important. We are now going through our LDC graduation process. So by 2030, we'll be out of LDC. I think that'll happen in the next couple of years, actually. So what should government look like at that time? I think from the citizens' perspective, government should look like a platform in their pocket. So it's not internet, it's some sort of a mobile service delivery. And that could be a combination of smartphones and maybe not so smartphones. So the government has to be in everybody's pocket in a very personalized way. So that's the vision for 2030 government. And 2041 will actually see a lot more different types of services. So you will actually see new types of services in the next 20 years. And we have a civil service 2041 agenda that we just coined, and we're working towards that. The government functionaries also have to believe government in my pocket story also. So what that really means is collaboration across different departments, data sharing, and looking at everything through the citizen size. And that's where we are trying to develop this concept of godpreneurship, that look through the service delivery through the citizen size and make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Anir. And Jaideep, over to you. What is your Vision 2030 for governments worldwide, and also your top one or two recommendations?
Yeah, wonderful question again, Ian. And I think, 2030 will see governments just become much closer to their citizens. Citizens will be at the heart of what governments do, and governments will be much more responsive to citizens' needs at the individual level. And this can happen in two ways. You can either bring citizens closer to the government, and you can do that using digital tools like our panelists have mentioned. Government in a pocket sounds like a great idea. You use digital tools to bring them closer, or you move government closer to people. You move the locus of power closer to them, away from, I would say, remote federal centralized governments, closer to local government in their city, town, village. And you can, of course, do both these at the same time. So for me, that's going to be the big shift. And then that will mean that governments can be much more responsive to the needs of citizens and be able to respond faster, better, cheaper to their citizens. My big idea is one that actually, is borrowed in a sense from the private sector, where all companies realize that they are doing two different things at the same time. They are delivering business as usual, current services, products to current customers with current technologies, but they're also having to reinvent themselves and come up with new ways of doing things faster, better, and cheaper. These are two very distinct things. And so they organize for it and they budget for it. They have the mass of the organization, there's the delivery bit, but you also have an R&D think tank, skunk works, budgeted to really look at new ideas that can be trialed, tested, and then scaled by the main organization. My hope is for governments to do this in a more systematic way. We see some examples of it, and our panelists have given brilliant examples of that. But we really ought to have governments that spend more and devote more time, not just money, to the learning function, to the experimentation, testing, and policy, evidence-based policy making function.
Jaideep, thank you so much. And go ahead, Anir.
May I just come in for 20 seconds?
Please do, yes.
Jaideep mentioned something important. So local government. So if the government is really in my pocket, there is no difference between local and national government. So it's all the same to me, because I don't want to differentiate between local and national government. The administrators may for administration purposes, but for citizens' sake, it should be in my pocket. So just wanted to address that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate you staying over longer than needed, but this has been so useful, from policy making to the future, to the changes that are happening, to experiences that we've had in changing governments' expectations and going forward. We're also living in unprecedented times, and government leaders are at at different levels of pressure, priorities, and so on. But I think technology is definitely something we can leverage, and we can use to scale. Thank you for being part of this GX Talks virtual session presented by Emirates Government Service Excellence Program in collaboration with the University of Cambridge, Judge Business School, and with knowledge partners Futuracy, Government Experience GX Initiative, and Dinar Standard. I would like to thank all of you for your time, for joining us and making this possible. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit gx.ae, where you'll find a lot more information about government experience and this session as well. So thank you, everybody, and take care.